Uh, we need five, I think.
Were set up, the goal
Deze tafel voor?
Voor de sprekers. Test, test, test. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from whichever part of the world you are watching from. And welcome to this UNGA side event, which is all about the potential of the creation of a UN generational test. Because people from whichever part of the world you are watching, you probably in your country have seen that young people are taking to the streets. And whether that is to speak up about racial injustices, whether it's about the climate crisis that is ongoing, or whether it is about any other form of inequality that they're speaking up about. The voices of young people are louder than ever, and they want to have a seat at the table. But unfortunately, we still see that, having structural youth participation at the table is still an ongoing challenge. Young people keep on getting invited sometimes for a one-off event, but not in a structural way. And in this event, we will explore a structural solutions to youth participation, which is the UN Generational Test. Now, my name is Haji Yacoubi. I'm a former UN Youth Representative for the Netherlands, but I'm above all a very, very, very honored moderator, one of the honored moderators who will help you in this session to guide you through all the amazing speakers that we will have. Now, I am also a firm believer that the best sessions are the most interactive ones, which is why we want to encourage you to send in your questions. If you're watching through the YouTube live stream, then you can see a live chat on the right side of your screen, and you can drop all the comments, remarks, questions, whatever it is you want to share with us. Please do so. And then me and my co-host Menno will try our best to pose as many of those questions as possible. And with that being said, I would like to give over the floor to you, Menno.
Thank you everyone who is here today. My name is Manal Moussane and I'm the current Dutch United Nations Youth Delegate on Human Rights and Security. I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this hybrid event. This side event is being organized by a few youth delegates who definitely deserve all honors of everything that we created for this side event. And a few of those countries are the United Nations youth delegates from Peru, Austria, Germany, and the United States of America. This event is officially co-sponsored by the Netherlands, and we have a fantastically great panel here with us today. And we would briefly like to introduce all of them to you. So first of all, we have the greatest mayor of The Hague, Mr. Jan van Zanen. You're allowed to enter the stage if you would like. We have Maurice Knijnenburg, who is the chair of the Dutch Youth Council. You are also allowed to enter the stage. We have a hybrid online entering Alexandria Ville Senior. She's an environmental youth activist. We have Tijmen Rozenboom, our ambassador for youth employment and education. You are also allowed to enter the stage. Then we have Dan Moxon, the director for People for Dialogue and Change. We have Krista Becker, who works for UNICEF at the United States of America. And we have Mert Kumru, our former UN Youth Delegate on Human Rights and Security. Without further ado, we would like to open our official side event with some opening words by our great mayor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, wherever you are. How good it is to see you all here together today, here in the Humanity Hub, in the heart of our UN city of The Hague. Thank you very much, Mert, for the invitation at the last minute, but that's okay. More than a year ago, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. We had to do that in an almost empty Peace Palace, the symbol of our international city of peace and justice. Luckily, the situation has now changed and we can be together again, hybridly though. Nevertheless, I will remember the celebration in the Peace Palace, where I had the pleasure of meeting Mert and 5 other young people present the Hague Youth Manifesto. A first and important step towards the inclusion of young people in the UN. And as mayor of The Hague, I'm very proud that this initiative began here in our city, with the support of Professor Alana O'Malley. Professor O'Malley is chair of United Nations Study in Peace and Justice at Leiden University and the Hague University of Applied Sciences, a position which was created in honor of my predecessor, Josias van Aartsen. But words and good intentions alone are not enough. And that is why it is so important that this meeting is taking place, to further reflect on the role of young people in the UN and especially what form this can take. More than ever, I believe, it is important that young people are able to do more than just make their voices heard. And that they are seated around the table and involved in decision making. And this is the direction we need to take. And not just in international fora, such as the United Nations, but in European, national, regional, and local bodies too. Because it's about your future. A future which will be defined by sustainability, inclusivity, and solidarity. A future in which, to loosely quote Spinoza, every single person is free from fear and can live in safety. Everyone. Wherever you may live or have been born. However you define your identity. Whether you practice a faith or not. Freedom from fear was one of the 4 freedoms formulated by President Roosevelt that laid the foundations for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Part, as of today, part of our DNA as a UN city. I wish you all a highly productive meeting. Please keep me informed of the results. Know that you can always count on me. Thank you very much. The youth has the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your inspiring words. And as you heard the mayor mention, and as you probably have seen in the title of this event, we're constantly going to be speaking about a generational test. And this concept might be vague to you, and we totally understand that. And to help you to get a grip on that concept of the generational test, we created a short video that will explain to you what the generational test means.
And still is. Back in 2015, when the 17 countries were set up, the goal was to achieve them all by 2030. This goal was, and still is, very much achievable. The UN Generational Test is trying to achieve just that. Cooperation between young and old. Cooperation between the global north and south. Cooperation between the UN and you. The UN Generational Test tries to solve the current problems that young people face all around the globe. Whether it's the climate crisis or the refugee crisis, all conflicts worldwide have one element in common. Young people will suffer the consequences the longest. It only makes sense to include them in decision-making now, but on one very important condition. Only if they can constructively join a discussion. The world does not need any more tokenism. In the spirit of SDG 16, our initiative seeks to propose the creation of a generational test. A test that makes sure that the interests and concerns of young people are taken seriously. Intergenerational problems require unconventional intergenerational dialogues and solutions. The era of blah, blah, blah has ended. We demand a seat at the table, permanently. Because the future of the UN can only be ensured if the future of the world is included.
Oh, we can get a little applause for that video. Okay, to everyone watching, we're not sure if you heard the echo, but if you did, honestly, I thought it contributed a bit to the blah, blah, blah segment because it echoes even more how much we are done with the blah and ready to step into the action. Now, we've heard it all in the video about what the generational test really aims to do. We know that young people will suffer the consequences of many of the problems that we are facing today for the longest time if we continue to act insufficiently on them. But to give you an even deeper insight into what a generational test could mean, and then specifically on a national perspective, we are more than honored that we are joined, I'm looking at you, Maurice, by an expert here in the panel and on our board. Maurice, you know all the ins and outs of the generational test, specifically on the national level, through your role as the chair of the Dutch National Youth Council, but also through your role as the chair of the youth platform of the Social Economic Council here in the Netherlands. Well, I would say more than enough knowledge and wisdom from your side that we're looking forward to hear. So the floor is all yours, Maurice.
Thanks. Well, let's hope so. I've prepared a small presentation. I don't know if you can get that up. Yeah. We can go to the next slide because, well, shocker, I'm going to talk about the generational test in the Netherlands. Well, let's first talk a little bit more about the SER youth platform that Hajar introduced. It was introduced in 2015 as official part of the Social Economic Council, which is a platform of a council that can advise the Dutch cabinet when asked, but also when we see it fit. And this platform consists of various youth organizations, including trade unions for young people, employers, school and student representatives, and the Dutch National Youth Council. In 2019, we published the first major study, Hoge Verwachtingen, High Expectations, which we thought was quite fitting regarding the opportunities that younger people have. And we measured the last 10 years from the economic crisis of 2012 until 2020, and we looked at what effects did policy have on young people. And indeed, Mert, we can go to the next slide. And well, maybe a shocker, probably not, is that we as a generation reach our milestones a lot when we're a few years older. So when looking at the finished education, was 23, it became 24 years old, permanent job, was 24 years old, became 27 years old, steady relationship, became 27, was 27, became 28 years old, and the percentage that owned a house, which was in 2008, 46%, which is quite a lot, was in 2017, 35%, and we're now looking at these data for 2020 or 2021, and we're seeing, well, I'm not going to spoil everything, but I believe that you can fill it in yourself. And Mert, we can go to the next slide, because this is quite important what we're seeing here. And the chairwoman of the Socio-Economic Council also said, this generation is almost living in a postponed life. And we looked into why is that, and then we're seeing that when making policy, there has to be much more attention on what effect it has on the lives of younger people. And unfortunately, that happens not really. And it's still happening way too rarely. And we're almost, well, certainly the last 10 years, we're seeing that policy is really made in what we call it's very compartmentalized. So education policy is only looking at the effects on students within their education. So the in the Netherlands, I'm looking for the word for the leenstelsel. Yeah.
Very long way.
Yeah. We're seeing that that also has effects on the job market, on the housing market. student loans, indeed. Which is quite easy, but okay. Mert, so we can go to the next slide. So we saw that was happening, and well, the answer how to resolve this problem is actually quite easy. Just talk to young people when you're creating this policy and looking at what effects does policy, for example, changing student loans, that system, what effect does it have on the broader life of younger people? So we proposed a generational test, specifically on a national level, to prevent that accumulation of policy from affecting young people disproportionately, because all these singular policies, well, singularly they can be accountable, and we can say, well, maybe it's not such a bad idea, but when putting them all together and looking at what effect it all as a whole has, it's not too great. Mert. Yeah. I basically just told that, so we can go to the next. And it was not only blah blah blah. We not only came up with the idea, we then talked to the Dutch Parliament, and they also said, well, maybe it took us quite a long time to figure this out, but good that you're coming with this suggestion. Let's go and do it. And we were quite surprised that they actually did something that we proposed, but it was quite a welcome surprise, I'd say. And I'm talking to Mert. Yeah. So the instrument of the generational test on a national level maps out the impact of policy, legislation, or regulations on the living conditions of generations in the present and in the future. It does so by looking at already existing data, quantitative and qualitative. And we're making the distinction between short term, so when implementing it, and the medium long term, 10 to 20 years, which is quite a long time, but still to not only look at, okay, we're changing this, what effect does this have now, but also what effect will this have on this generation and other generations 10 or 15 years from now, which is something that, well, hasn't really ever been done with Dutch policy, which is, well, we think it's quite a good idea to start. Well, the outcomes of the analysis will be weighed, and of course, when will be taken into account when implementing the official policy, and so we can change the policy before it's actually implemented to create actually better policy. Mert. So lastly, the main policy areas are income, education, job market, the housing market, healthcare, climate and sustainability, democracy and participation, which covers, well, nearly every major theme that especially young people are now struggling with. So it's a start. Maybe it's not the perfect idea, or maybe it's not the perfect solution to everything, but we really believe that this has the potential to become one of those elements that can really help not only the younger generation, but generations as a whole. This can also have an effect on 30 or 40-year-olds when looking at, for example, a new the housing market, which will probably be changed in the next 10, 15 years. We not only have to look at the effects for younger people, but for all generations, that has to be taken into account. So in a short presentation, that is our idea of the generational test in the Netherlands.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. Now, you said some interesting things indeed. For instance, that we as young people were living a postponed life, as it were, the way that you explained it, you know, reaching our milestones at later stages. And we got a question from the audience online watching because they were really curious. You know, as the chair of the Dutch National Youth Council, you have a lot of contact with young people from with other national youth councils all over the world. Do you know, by any chance, if this best practice of a generational test is already being implemented elsewhere, or are we really at the forefront over here of that race?
Well, the idea isn't really new. We have seen for the last 10, 15 years ideas that look like this, but not exactly the generational test as we're implementing it right now in the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you so much. Once more, people, can we have a big round of applause for Maurice?
Thank you so much, Maurice. And we'll move on to our second speaker. And if you thought your moderators were young, we're going to shock you. Because our second speaker is only 16 years old. And she's having a huge title. And she's speaking for so many young people. So we're very delighted to have you here with us. Please welcome Alexandria Villaseñor.
I think we'll be with Alexandria in a bit. Maybe also interesting to know is that she is currently at COP26. She is a very, very, very well-known climate activist. So I think more than ever, and a nice position to hear from her and her ideas about youth participation, but also maybe a little insight on what is going on there, since we are already on the first day, with today being the World Leaders Summit. Doing a quick check to the back to see if we can get her on the screen. I see some things are happening, and then hopefully very shortly we can see Alexandria with us on the screen. And yes, there she is. Alexandria, good to have you with us.
Hi everyone, I apologize for the sound and lighting. It's the second day of COP, and so I've been running around nonstop today, but I'm really excited to be able to virtually join you all. So I'm Alexandria Villaseñor. I'm a 16-year-old climate activist and the founder of Earth Uprising International. And I wanted to talk to you all about the importance of youth in decision-making rooms and the importance of youth activism as well. And so, first of all, I got involved in this movement 3 years ago. And at that time, I was 13 when I first got involved. And it was because I saw the effects of the climate crisis in my own community. After I was in my hometown when the Camp Fire happened in Paradise, California. And at the time, that wildfire was the worst wildfire in California's history. It blanketed the entire area in thick, unbreathable smoke. And so I have asthma, and that was a very scary experience. And so I started researching and learning about climate change and the connection to California's wildfires. And that really made me want to get involved and do something, take some sort of action. And so after researching and learning the connections, I knew that I had to do something, and I started striking in front of the United Nations headquarters on December 14th of 2018. And I ended up striking actually every single Friday all the way up until the beginning of the pandemic. And so what happened was I saw climate change happening, and that inspired me to take all of my eco-anxiety and climate anxiety and turn it into action. But my story isn't necessarily unique. There are so many young people all around the world who are experiencing the effects of climate change, and they're taking motivation from that, and they're turning it into action. And most young people who get involved are involved because they're doing it to protect their community, and they are getting involved to protect their home, and because they saw the effects of the climate crisis. And so right now there's so many young people involved in this movement, and we need so many more young people finding their climate story and getting involved. And so I have 3 tips that I want to say, first of all, for getting involved and doing some sort of action. And the first one is find your climate story too, because right now we are seeing the effects of the climate crisis all around the world, but we're experiencing it in different ways. So how are you being impacted by climate change? And then from there, what do you want to do about it? Do you want to get involved in direct action? Do you want to work on policy or law? And so find out what your passions are and use them for good. And then as well, join a movement of people, join an organization or a group that focuses on your passions, because when you're united in this cause with other people, it makes it so much easier to be in it for the long haul, because this is a marathon and it's not a sprint. And so being in a movement with people is also really important. And so there's also the need for youth in decision-making rooms. And after young people get involved, they want to make their voices heard even more. And we are actually making a seat for ourselves at the decision-making table. And this is my second COP that I'm at. And what I'm noticing is that there's so much more young people here than there has been in a really long time. And that is because our generation is going to be impacted the most by the climate crisis. Our generation, it's going to affect where we end up going to school, where we end up living. And a lot of young people are even having conversations about whether or not they want to have kids. And so our generation is going to be impacted the most by climate change. And that means that we have to be in these decision-making rooms and we have to be there making our voices heard. And so sometimes people ask, well, how do you do that? And you just have to make the space for yourself if no one is making it for you. And so youth are constantly pushing and making sure that our voices are heard. And at COP right now, this is a great example about how we're making sure that our voices are being heard, because what ends up coming out from these big global conferences are going to directly impact our future. So make your voices heard, because whether or not world leaders or people in positions of power want to hear us, we need to be there.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for your insightful story. It's so hard to even think about it. That you, at the age of only 13 years old, were climate striking in front of a building, skipping school, to actually explain that there's no need to go to school when there's no earth that you will be living on in a few years. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. You also very rightly said that the outcomes of the COP will influence the lives that the other younger generations will have on this planet. And immediately a question popped up from the audience, and it stated, do you think that this COP, so COP26, will actually work for youth? So will youth be satisfied with the results that they're gathering there?
Well, we will be satisfied if we actually get the action that we need. And so right now there has been a lot of work by young people, and especially by Polluters Out, to make sure that there are no fossil fuel executives in there. There's no people who don't have the best interests in mind. And so there's been a lot of work by groups and young people to make sure that we have those in there who care, but still we have to make sure that something happens. And so I know I personally will not be satisfied until world leaders take action to reduce our global greenhouse gas emissions in half and stay in line with the IPCC report and stay in line with the science, and that they also acknowledge what is happening when it comes to children's rights. And so I'm a part of a complaint called the Children versus Climate Crisis complaint, where myself, Greta Thunberg, and 14 other children filed a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, stating that Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Turkey, and France were violating our rights by their inaction on the climate crisis. And so we waited over a year to hear a response about whether our complaint was admissible or not admissible. And a couple weeks ago, we got a result after waiting over a year. And they filed our complaint as inadmissible, basically saying that they do not believe that our rights are being violated by world leaders in action. And so this has set a precedent that world leaders and those do not care about children's rights when it comes to the violations of climate change and that impact. And so that means that those a part of the complaint are going to continue pushing to make sure that world leaders acknowledge that children's rights are being violated by climate change, and that they also do something about it. Because the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely ratified treaty, and Article 6 of it says that children have an inherent right to life, and climate change is directly impacting that. And so, so long answer, but basically we have, until we actually get the action that we need, then we will not be satisfied.
Alessandra, I wish I could say that I'm shocked by the way our world leaders responded, but I guess we're not. We're used to these answers, so we're very, very grateful that you're there at the COP to speak at least for our generations and the generation coming. We're not the only ones being fans of you, because we see another question from the audience as well, and they're wondering, Alexandra, if you had to choose to either protest or politics, what would you prefer?
Well, that is, I think that that's an easy question for myself to answer. I would definitely choose protest because I know that there are so many young people as well who are in politics. And so that's what I really like about the youth climate movement is that there's always someone taking action in different ways. And so even though I choose protest, I know there would be other young people in politics. So definitely protests. And there's a lot of protests happening this week, actually.
So cool to hear. Thank you so much for joining us, Alessandria.
Yes. Can we have one big round of applause? Now, while our next speaker might not be as young as Alexandra just was, he is still very young at heart. Youth at heart is something that he really embodies, because we really are honored and very, very happy that we're able to welcome our next speaker, Tijmen Rosenboom, who is the ambassador for youth, employment and education. Tijmen, the floor is all yours. Can we have one big round of applause and then take it away?
Thank you, Hajar, and thank you for emphasizing before we start that I'm an old man. Thank you. No, it's really great to be here, and it's a really wonderful discussion, actually, to see everyone here and to hear these different perspectives. We heard a mayor, so a local perspective, the national perspective for Maurice, and I myself work as an ambassador at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so my role is more international, so to say. So I really want to lay out that, that position as well, the importance of meaningful youth participation and involving young people within our foreign policy and within the work that we do as well. So indeed, you already alluded to it. There is this strategy, Youth at Heart, which is the strategy that we have launched, really specifically focusing on the challenges and opportunities that young people face. So on the one hand, that means within our development cooperation, we want to focus on education, on skills, we want to focus on jobs, but definitely also on meaningful youth participation. Because you can't talk about this issue without mentioning the voice of young people, because it's in the end, it is about their position. It's about, are they being listened to? Are they being heard? Are they being prioritized? So meaningful youth participation for me is a very important part of what I do. Youth very often, and we heard that today as well, we hear it more often, youth feel unheard. They still feel, specifically in this time of Zoom and MS Teams, they feel like they're on mute. And I think it is very important that we try to unmute the voice and that we really use sessions such as this, and also definitely also the COP, as we just heard, as important venues to make sure that there is meaningful youth participation. So what do we do at our level, at the ministry? On the one hand, we really try to work on this meaningful youth participation in our programs, in the projects that we run, in the countries where we prioritize our development cooperation. So that is Africa and the Middle East. And on the other hand, we can actually try to integrate the voice of young people within our diplomacy. And we also try to develop some tools. Sometimes, well, you need to add a chair to the table, as was mentioned, or you bring your own chair, as was said, or actually sometimes you need to build an entire new table. Like, for example, we try to do with our virtual forum, really trying to create a specific space where policymakers can go into discussion with young people. Because if our world is so young, and if a lot of the work that we do as foreign affairs is actually in countries where people are so young, we need to adapt our work to their reality, to the reality on the ground, which is a young reality. So we also started up a Youth Advisory Committee, which is going to be launched soon, the 22nd of November. And this is ways we try to include youth as partners, as leaders. And I think this is important at UN level as well, and that's why we're here together. This intergenerational dialogue, this meaningful youth participation is an essential discussion. How are we going to make sure that we strengthen what already happens and that we are connecting the dots to come to meaningful youth participation? How to unmute the voices? Is the generational test could of course be a very interesting example, and Maurice, you explained it really well. A great example of a best practice that could actually be translated to the UN level, and how can we do that? So we want to further this agenda at an international level, and we hope that this session today and that the generational test can serve as an inspiration. So this is a very important discussion, and I really want to thank actually the youth envoys that have worked so hard on it, on this session today, and everyone who's present. You know, the Dutch youth envoys for sure, Manal and Mert, but also from the USA, from Peru, from Austria, from Switzerland, from Belgium, from Germany, Albania, Israel. It's a very impressive, broad group of youth representatives that came together to make this point and to actually start this discussion. So thank you once again, and thank you for inviting me as well.
Thank you so much, Tijmen. Thank you so much. And hey, you mentioned that the international setting is something that you really work in, and you spoke about, you know, there are so many forms of youth participation that are being worked with. We have the UN Youth Envoy from the UN, the Major Group of Youth and Children. We have indeed our youth representatives themselves via the missions. Do you think, and you touched upon this lightly, but maybe you could elaborate, do you think that the generational test could like bring that all together? What is the potential of it, do you think?
The potential is, of course, very big because it's such an interesting best practice, right? It is something that also in the Netherlands where we're starting up, and that we could actually, as we learn, as we go, we could actually already translate those lessons internationally. Because indeed, what you said, there is, of course, at the UN level, there is the Office of the Youth Envoy, the Agenda 2030, and the UN Common Agenda, which is very important to emphasize, is very much focusing on the issues of the challenges and opportunities of young people as well. There is all these funds and agencies that at different level, like UNHCR or UNICEF, are really working on youth participation. You know, there's what you said, there's a lot happening. And of course, the UN is not a Dutch government, as in it doesn't have regulations or policy in the way that the government has. So it will always look different. But I think what we're doing here, we're discussing how this best practice, this way of thinking, so to say, this way of actually making sure that there's an intergenerational dialogue, one that is actually more institutionalized. Because you don't want it to be completely fragmented, you want to connect dots, and you also want to make sure that it doesn't depend on the goodwill of some people, because we also see that in our work. Like sometimes there's a certain topic or a colleague who's super active on this. What you want is to have it more institutionalized. And I think there is what could really be an issue, the big opportunity here for the generational test at the UN level. And I think we need to see how it will work with an organization so hybrid and so big as the UN.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for elaborating on that. You're not off the hook yet, Tijmen, because the audience wants to hear more from you. They're saying we want more in a virtual way by asking you a question. They want to know, you know, you've seen a lot at the UN, you've through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where you currently work, but also through all your UN work. And people are curious, do you think that the youth participation that is currently taking place at the United Nations is meaningful enough, or do you see room for improvement?
Oh, there's definitely room for improvement. I mean, I would say this, the exact same thing about our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yes, we're taking steps. We got an advisory committee. We've got interesting tools to make sure that there's more meaningful youth participation. Same at the UN level. I'm not going to elaborate on that again. But yes, it can improve. I mean, I've also learned by doing, right? As in, you actually learn how important it is to have feedback, to make sure that there is this feedback loop in when you actually involve young people. I also had to learn that. And you all pointed at me once, Hajar, that I need to get better at being interactive on my social media game. I haven't forgotten that. And these are very important. No, but this is important because it shows that you need to be in a dialogue. You need to have feedback. And I think that, and you need to institutionalize it. And I think that these are all things that we are learning, and at the same time, I definitely see room for improvement there at the UN level as well. Although I see at different ways they are working on it, but yes, room for improvement.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And people, I think we can now all expect Tijmen to step up his game by starting a TikTok account. Starting next week, you can see him doing the savage love dances on there, so make sure to check that out. No, probably not. We'll work on that. We'll work on the lobby. Can we have one big round of applause for Tijmen once again? Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, We are going on to our next speaker, a digital speaker, and we're very honored to have him here with us because none other than Dan Moxon is joining us. He is the Director of People Dialogue and Change, and we are very, very, very delighted to have him here with us. Let's see if we can get Dan onto the screen so that he can share all his insights and wisdom with us. I see you're already here, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is all yours.
I hope you can hear me okay. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be invited. I think what you've asked me to talk a little bit about here is my experience of supporting the EU Youth Dialogue process, which is a really large-scale participatory process involving 50,000 young people in all the countries of the EU, and it's institutionalized, just as the way we were talking about a second ago. It's kind of built into the fabric of the laws. It has a statutory footing. So it really is this institutional process through which governments at both international and national level can engage with young people in their policy making, really. And I think that's the real key thing that I would share that we've learned from this process with the generational test is the complexity of doing participatory institutional work with many, many different countries and international actors at once. Because I think sometimes in these processes, we run the risk of creating the idea that the UN level or the EU level is in charge of the nation states, when actually the relationship between them is much, much more complex than that. So when you're doing participatory work to make it meaningful, you really have to have a very supportive nation state that's committed to working with someone like a National Youth Council to making the international dimensions of this participatory process work, and not trying to think that if you get something done at the UN level, that the UN will tell the nation states what to do. It's really much more complex than that. So this kind of shared leadership at national level, across both youth civic society and across government ministers, I mean, really the kind of things you're starting to talk about in the previous input is really crucial for making the whole thing tick. And that leads to kind of really good quality deliberation, understanding of how and when change can happen, opportunities to create policy making when that happens. But that all has to be backed up, I think, by also very, very large scale involvement work. So we're involving not just 30, 40, 50 young people, but 50,000, 60,000. So that our nation states, our government institutions, our international institutions have a method of talking to many, many thousands of young people, admittedly, probably not in the same deepest sort of ways, but that these bodies that control and influence young people's lives have a real relevance to the majority of the population and really young people from very, very diverse walks of life, really. What I really like about the intergenerational test is I think it has the capability of putting young people's voices into context with the voices of other generations. And too much in participation, we talk about young people asking for something and decision makers saying yes or no to it. But actually the reasons why they say yes or no is actually far more complex. It's about the tensions with pressure from other generations, pressure from corporate lobbyists, pressure from all sorts of different actors in society. And I think the generational test is a really good way of showing the relatively different priority or usually lower priority that young people's voices are currently getting compared to other generations and compared to other actors in society. So, I mean, I think it's a really exciting initiative to be piloting, to be pushing. I really look forward to seeing where it goes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sudan. Thank you so much. Dan, thank you so much for elaborating on that from your perspective. The audience also submitted a question to you. You already mentioned incredible numbers, by the way, 50,000, 60,000 young people. You know, very often when we talk about young people, we use the term as if it encompasses one sort of young person, but we all know that, of course, young people, that's not a homogeneous group, it's a heterogeneous group with so many people from all walks of life. The question that the audience has for you is, how do we ensure that we speak and engage with young people from all these different places in society, so all different genders, sexualities, but also socioeconomic backgrounds?
I think that's an absolutely fantastic question. The first point is just acknowledging that. And then from an institutional process, I think it's fairly straightforward and is about the direction of resources. It's about systematically keeping track of who our large-scale processes are engaging, working out who is not engaged, and then directing resources towards the engagement and towards outreach work to target those that we know whose voices are currently being unheard or currently being dismissed. And then working with the specialist sort of NGOs and outreach organizations to do that. And then I think the other side of it is to recognizing that just as young people aren't homogenous, their voices aren't necessarily homogenous. So actually what might be good for young people in the global north might not necessarily be good for young people in the global south. What might young men might be asking for might be different for what women or non-binary people are asking for. And it's really making sure that in these very big participatory processes, we don't just say young people want this as if they're a set of bees and they all think with a hive mind and they're all completely together, that we're open about many young people have this position, but many others have this one, and these are why, and these are the competing needs.
I love that analogy you made about young people not being bees. Sometimes I do buzz around, but that's totally different things. Another point that you mentioned that I found very interesting is, of course, you know, we also always say, you know, the United Nations or the EU, for that matter, is only as strong as its member states are. Ultimately, how do you think that one should go best about enforcing this lobby to get more time and attention and money and energy towards in this case, a generational test, but in general, youth participation for individual member states?
So I think the international frameworks and roles that people set out, like the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, they're really important lobbying tools for activists and NGOs at the national level. They're very important for setting the framework and standard of what should be expected across the world. But ultimately, I think we really have to work quite intensely at national level to think about how those things are actually embedded, how they play out in all of our institutions, and really to address both angles simultaneously. So making sure that we use international law to make sure things are happening in the ground in people's towns and villages and the communities that they're part of from day to day.
Much, Dan. We'll be back with you in the panel discussion, but can we have one big round of applause for Dan, everyone? Thank you so much.
We now came to our last speaker before we move on to the panel discussion, and for that we would like to welcome Krista Becker, and she is the Director of UNICEF United States of America. Thank you so much for tuning in, Krista.
Apologize in advance. I came down with a cold and I've lost my voice, but I will do my best to speak meaningfully to this. Thank you guys for having me. I am Krista Becker and I'm the Community Engagement Operations Manager here at UNICEF USA. I'm based in New York City out of our national office. At UNICEF USA, we promote youth-led engagement and youth-led advocacy. This is important in both our programming and projects, but also in our planning, our advocacy, and our strategies. Personally, I oversee the Youth Volunteer Engagement Strategy for the United States, which includes our UNICEF Unite Clubs program, which had over 500 high schools and colleges and universities in the last year, which equated to over 6,000 active club members throughout the United States. And I also oversee and work directly with our National Youth Council program, which is comprised of 15 youth advocates in high school and college or university that work closely with UNICEF USA to represent youth voice throughout the country. And numbers-wise, this equates to over 17,000 active youth volunteers, against over 6,000 being active within our clubs program throughout the United States. So I work really closely with my colleagues in advocacy, fundraising, and communications with the organization to ensure that UNICEF Unite programs is empowering and responsive to youth voice, youth experience, and youth activism.
So much, Krista. Let's first have I thought we would do the round of applause afterwards, but we'll do it twice for you. You spoke so nicely about the youth-led engagements #activism strategy, and I think the reason for that, a question from the audience came up because they were wondering if you had the opportunity to share some best practices with other countries, what would you tell them in a way, as in how can we even better use youth participation in our legislation?
Question. really what I would suggest is having youth consulted and part of the solution at every step of the way. And this is everything from the very beginning in the planning process to the final stages of the execution. And really importantly, which is often forgotten, the assessment process. What went well? What didn't go well? What can we learn from for next time?
Thank you so much. I think that's a full answer to the question that you had. Thank you so much for being here. Let's do another round of applause for you.
Yes, indeed. A big thanks to Chris and, of course, to all our speakers. Now we are entering the juicy detail of this event, namely the panel discussion. It's always nice to hear from our speakers, perhaps things that they learned from each other, insights that they have learned throughout this event, or maybe messages and even advice, pieces of advice they have for each other. And maybe I can start with our very first speaker of the day that we had, Maurice. Maurice, I'm going to actually test if you've been listening really well to the other speakers, because I'm really curious. What are some insights that you have learned through, through the messages and through the speeches of the speakers that really stuck with you, and you're going to take along with you in your work as a chair of the Dutch National Youth Council?
Well, one of the main things that really stuck with me was the fact that, first of all, so many young people are trying their best to get their voices heard, and that's we're getting better and better at that. But the funny thing is that we're all trying to find those institutional ways to find our way in, which is almost adapting ourselves. And it's good to see that people like Alexandra are then also saying, it's good that you're doing this, but I'm still going to strike and I'm still going to speak up to them. That is, I think, a very healthy mix, and we're seeing that more and more. And I think that that's we're almost infiltrating those old institutions to get our point across. And I think that's a really it's a beautiful thing that's happening.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Maurice, we see that another question popped up for Tijmen. And the question is the Dutch government willing to share the Youth at Heart strategy with the UN, for example?
But of course we are. No, it's not a secret strategy. It's very much open, out in the open, and we are proud of it. So yes, this is definitely something that we want to share. We want to share our lessons, the lessons that we have learned with the UN as well. And we'll of course take this discussion on board as well. But no, definitely, it's for everyone. Just go to youthatheart.nl. I'm being pushed here to be a bit, to talk about our own strategy. So no, yes, definitely.
Thank you so much, Tijmen. To be quite frank, he handed us €5 before the event to ask him this question. No, I'm just kidding. It's really a question from the audience, so thank you so much for posing that. And maybe also turning to our online panel, maybe Alexandria, if I can start with you. I'm really curious, we're talking about ways to implement youth participation, best practices. I think we're very much sort of on the same page here about the importance. But you are today at a conference where there are many heads of state who might not, in their actions, be implementing it as much. Do you think that they have some lessons to learn when it comes to youth participation? And how do you think we can best let them know that it's time now to change behavior?
It was really funny. A couple days ago, I was at the Conference of Youth, COI, and I was leading a workshop around education. And a young person, I started going around and talking to a bunch of people in the workshop, and they started talking about how we need to be the ones educating our world leaders. We're not the ones who need to be educated. They are the ones who need to be taking the lead on this. And I think that, in some ways that is the case, but in the sense that youth activists need to be making our voices heard and telling our world leaders what we want to see and telling them what actions they need to take. And so I think that at COP especially, there's going to be a lot of young people out there having meetings with our world leaders and having meetings with those who are in positions of power to tell them what we want to see. And a lot of youth have been coming together and putting together demands, especially that they want our world leaders to take, because after over a year of protesting and being on the street, people would say, well, what exactly do you want to see? What type of actions do you want to see? And we're going to COP and we're telling them exactly what we want to see now.
I love that. And indeed, it's not the young people that need to be empowered. I think they are already very much empowered. I think it's more so the people with the grayer hair in the chairs that might need to take a listen to all the ideas that young people share. Thank you so much.
Alexandria, there's another question for you, and they're actually asking you what your current vision is on the climate crisis and what the vibe is at the COP26.
Sorry, it broke out. Was that a question for me?
Yeah. Would you
well, who are at COP, I think one of the main things that we bring to these conversations is our imagination. A lot of adults in positions of power especially say that we need to be thinking realistically, but I think that youth have to be in these conversations because we do bring our imagination, we bring creativity, and we don't necessarily think in the political structures that a lot of adults have been ingrained in. And so we think outside of the box. We think about what has to happen, not what politically can happen. And so my vision at COP is that we have a unified movement coming together, and that of course, that we get action out. And it's been 6 years since the Paris Agreement. And so I believe that this is the COP where our world leaders, their homework is due from that agreement. And so, my vision is that we get the action that we want to see, as simple as that. And if we have to bring our creativity and have to say that we know that this can happen, then we're going to be bringing that too.
Super clear, I think. Yeah. Chris, I have another question for you. I mean, coming from your perspective, being part of UNICEF and also all the work that UNICEF does. I mean, you mentioned the numbers and all over the world. You are active. I think it's one of the more well-known agencies also of the UN. I've heard a lot about participation and how it's like within also the Convention of the Rights of the Child. There's very much also a potential human rights-based aspect to youth participation. How do you think that those two link, the human rights frameworks that we have and the youth participation that we want to create? Do you think there's some potential of connecting those two more tightly?
Absolutely, yeah. That's human rights, our children's rights, our youth rights, and they need to be connected, and we need youth voice there to help us connect those things. It's very well known in the United States, we are one of the only countries that has not passed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that's for a myriad of reasons, but we need youth at the table to help us in passing that. Some of the work that we do here at UNICEF USA is we put youth directly in the rooms, leading the conversations with congressional staffers and members of Congress to advocate for funding for UNICEF, but we also advocate on behalf of a lot of legislation that affects youth directly. And we need to advocate on behalf of the CRC and passing that. And so, yes, absolutely. Those things are completely tied.
There's another question for Dan, and the question says, is the current EU framework fit for all youth?
What does fit for all youth look like, I think? I mean, in any kind of policy making, when you ask these questions, there is always space and room for improvement. There are always further that you can go. And so I think one of the things we risk doing, or that we do a lot, and rightly so, is kind of compare ourselves to a paradise and try to work towards it. So there are definitely spaces for improvement. One of the things I think, I mentioned 50,000 young people as an outreach. This is tiny. There are millions and millions and millions of young people in the EU. So if we're talking about democratic renewal, really engaging everyone in a population, those are rookie numbers. I want to see millions of people involved in these kind of frameworks. And I think one of the things that we miss too much in our youth policy is the economic dimensions. And I thought it was interesting when you showed the list of policy areas that you wanted to address earlier on the generational test, but the financial policy, these are things that really are very far removed from many people's debate and experience that often we don't consider enough, and we don't involve young people in most effectively when we're thinking about how does that affect our social policy, how does that affect our environmental policy, because in many, many countries, these are the things that are actually driving the change that are far removed from the housing policy. They're the things that really dictate where housing ends up. So I think there's really a lot of space for improvement, but I think it's also come a long way. I mean, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, EU youth policy was largely about running youth exchanges and getting everyone to get to know each other a bit more. Now we're doing something a little bit more progressive and a little bit more exciting.
I think that's a good point. And over here in the Hague here live with us, I see Tammy, you're nodding very very rigorously because obviously your mandate as an ambassador, it's not just related to youth in general, but it's also to their access to education and to work. Dan mentioned this economic dimension that's very important. How do you link the three of them? How do you see their the importance of linking them?
Yeah, I think they're essentially two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you have investing in, let's say, the future and the prospects of young people through education and work, who are also, of course, completely interlinked. I don't think that there's any young person who doesn't know that how important it is to the skills you have will define the type of job that you can either get or create. I mean, these two are, of course, completely interlinked. But then also the whole issue of youth voice and youth empowerment and participation is two sides of the same coin with the whole issue of education and work. I mean, you can't talk about projects, for example, on education, if you don't mention the whole issue of what is the voice of young people. Are they being prioritized in politics? Are they actually being listened to? So these are not separate discussions. That's why for me it's one and the same discussion, and I try to have that at least within our ministry as one subject, and at least in my mandate it is one. So, but I've also learned a lot from what I've heard today from some of the other speakers, right? I mean, in the sense of the reminder that youth are not a homogeneous group. We know, but it's so good to continuously be aware of that. The fact that we need to go up in numbers, which I thought was very ambitious, and I really like that as well. Or, for example, the Alexandria's point of actually showing that there is more youth participation happening, that she sees an improvement, doesn't necessarily mean that she sees that people are listening better. So I think that there are so many things that we can also take away from this discussion, which for me was very insightful. I'm sorry that I immediately got that in as well, but that's why I was nodding, because I was listening to those people sharing their wisdom, and I was just really happy to hear it.
That's amazing to hear. Honestly, thank you so much for sharing time. Maybe quickly, we also received a question for Maurice, because people are curious, being the chair of the Dutch National Youth Council, how is that cooperation with youth councils in other countries?
Great question, actually. It's getting there. We're more and more seeing the importance of organizing yourselves, especially to get these major points across on the international tables, but we also see the difficulties that almost every National Youth Council is facing, which is also funding. It's the main priority is still getting your voices heard on the national level, so the international level is often also a luxury. Most National Youth Councils can't really afford themselves, so it's still a struggle, even in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Maurice. And we have another question coming in. It's a very interesting question. It was actually addressed to Dan and Alexandria. So whoever wants to address it, maybe it would be interesting to do both. So maybe let's start with you, Dan. And the question is, do you support lowering the legal voting age to 16?
I see no reason why people of 16 and 17 shouldn't be given that it's a right, and they have the competence to exercise that right, in my opinion. But I don't also think that it's necessarily something that will revolutionize our democracies. Actually, if people aren't giving people the right to vote when they don't want to vote for our current set of politicians and they don't trust political institutions, that doesn't change the democratic situation very substantially. There's a number of things that have to come together to make our democracies healthier.
Thank you, Dan. Moving on to you, Alexandria.
Oh, about the voting age? I definitely think so. I know there are a lot of young people that I know who are 16, 17, who know a lot more about politics than some of their parents do. And actually, in the election that happened recently, there was a report that came out that said that teenage girls were actually the ones who were the most persuasive in talking their parents into voting for a climate candidate. And so if we already have young people who are persuading their parents to vote for the right candidates, then why not have the young people voting themselves?
Here, Alexandra, sounds so logical. Let's do it.
We're totally pro, at least. Thank you so much for sharing for that. Maybe also going to you, Krista. We have a question from our online audience. And before I tell you the question, also we have a physical audience here with us, guys, acknowledging you at this point. But we also very much want to hear from you. So after this question, we're going to get over to you. So get your brains crackling and wackling. That's even a word. To ask some questions to our panel. But moving back to you, Krista, there is a question from the audience saying, you know, UNICEF is quite well known among most people from the UN agencies. How do you think we should best go about getting our messages out of a bubble, out of this international politics bubble, into to the general audience and get them to understand the importance of, in this case, United Nations generational test?
It's a great question. And I think that the easiest way and the best way to do that is through our youth. And so that's part of what we do through our youth clubs program is we engage our youth and we educate our youth in a way that they can peer-to-peer educate each other, and they can educate their parents at home, and they can educate their teachers, and they can educate people that they interact with in the community on children's rights issues. So I think that's really the best way, is to get on the ground. We have so many volunteers on the ground that we educate so that they can then educate the people in their community. And I think, and what we've seen is youth leading that education and youth leading those talks has brought so much more change and so much more positive interactions from adults as well than anything else at this point.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that.
Audience, and we completely forgot you might have some very insightful questions.
They're always in our hearts, people, so...
Is there anyone who would like to ask a question to one of our panelists?
Yeah? Yes, I'd like to ask a question. And maybe you can help me... Oh.
Yeah.
Maybe you can help me like direct it as well. But I was wondering in which ways the voices of the youth were going to be translated in this generational test. I think I heard something in the first presentation about it being on based on existing data and studies, and could those maybe be outdated? How would that be renewed, and how would that, how would the voice of the youth be incorporated in this generational test? If somebody could elaborate on that.
Yeah. Good question. I think maybe we could also sort of phrase it in a way that we ask our panelists, how do you think it could best be implemented? And maybe we have someone who is a bona fide young person standing here. Maurice, would you like to go first?
It's a great question, and we've been thinking a lot about that as well. I think the importance is getting both the data and qualitative and quantitative, so getting those voices heard. And what I also think that's very important is when we have the data and we are analyzing that, getting that as the starting point of a debate with young people about what is this meaning for you, how is this going to affect you, is this because in the end it's I think all about weighing both sides, and then it's very important to also have the data but also get young people to talk about that data, I think.
Thank you, Maurice. Yeah, I saw that Dan was nodding as well, and of course you are the youth expert we have with us in our panel, so do you maybe want to elaborate on the question as well?
The real challenge is harmonizing the policy-making cycles with the participatory cycles, because you can do kind of a very large consultation and participatory processes. But if they're moving at a different speed to when and where policies are made, when and where decisions are happening, then it's very, very hard to create a connection and an influence. So I would imagine something like building in kind of very systematic, large-scale consultation to set priorities and establish the qualitative data around what people want. And then perhaps a more, every time a new initiative is proposed or an idea is proposed, that you might have a smaller scale thing that takes that data and looks at, let's apply the generational test to this new resolution or this new proposal, and to see what we think the impact will be. Then that might not necessarily be as strongly participative, but you have a good solid base of information to draw from. Because sometimes the timing of policies and the timing of participation are very, very tricky to interconnect together there, really.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dan. And maybe touching upon something that you said earlier, because earlier you mentioned, of course, not every young person is the same, and not every young person has the same opinions or same needs in a way. You mentioned there is a difference, for example, between young people from the Global North and Global South. There is a question actually related to that sent in by our online audience, and I'm going to ask it to both you, Tijmen, and Alexandra, if you would. I would love to hear from the both of you on this. How, and maybe starting with you, Tijmen, how in your work as an ambassador for education, youth and employment, how do you make sure that we also get the voices of young people from the Global South sufficiently in there?
Yes, well, thank you for that question by someone out there. It is, of course, a very vital question, because in the end, sometimes the question should also be, how do we also make sure that the voices of Dutch young people are part of what we do, because we try to connect. For me, it is actually the first go-to is actually to make sure that we involve young people from the areas where we do most of our work in development cooperation. So that is Africa and the Middle East. That is where we mostly get the voices from. So when we do our programming, on the one hand, you do that by actually supporting young people. When you're doing your, for example, your education program, make sure that you involve young people at different levels, as Krista also said. It's about monitoring, it's about the policy development, and indeed how to time it. That is a very good point by Dan. That is the big challenge, but it means that you have to involve young people from the South in your program, in the work that you do. Our Youth Advisory Committee is actually consisting of mostly, or actually almost exclusively, international young people. There will also be Dutch participation to make sure that we actually connect those two, right? To connect the national level and the international level. And if you look at what we did with our virtual forum, trying to, also goes a bit into the quantitative or the qualitative. We try to actually make sure that we got the voice of young people, although I know they're not an homogeneous group, but to get the voice of young people and through youth-led research. Because they are in the end able, you got young researchers who will be able to talk to their community. And that is another way to make sure that you get more than 1,000 voices, and at least that can inform you on your policy. So for me, getting these voices from also the Global South, I'm not a big fan of that term, but okay, is actually a crucial part of the work.
Thank you so much. And I love how you said, you know, it's all about making connections, but also connecting with young people who are standing in the middle of their generation and understand everything about that. Alexandra, you mentioned earlier that this is your second COP. Now, I think in the past weeks, we've been able to read a lot online and in the news about, you know, this COP not being super inclusive when it comes to young people being represented from, for example, the Global South, but also young people from, you know, socioeconomic backgrounds with less money. How do you think we should go about including young people better from these backgrounds? And how do you think that would fit into, for example, international conferences such as the COP26 where you are currently?
Is looking to be one of the most exclusive COPs we've had in a while. And it's because there are a lot of young people and groups that should be in these conversations that weren't able to actually be here because of lack of resources, lack of funding, and of course housing. And so one thing that's really important though is that we do have those communities represented, because we will not get the solutions that we need without them. You need to make sure that we have communities who are being affected the most by the climate crisis in the conversation room, so you can actually get the solutions that will be best for those communities and especially everyone. If we have one same group of people making the decisions, then we won't get what we need. We need those in the Global South. We need indigenous people. We need all of those people in these conversations so that we actually get the solutions that will be best. And so one thing that we talk a lot about is that we cannot get climate action without climate justice. And I think that that is the main motto that young people are bringing to COP, is that we need climate justice and social justice in order to actually get the action that we need. And so there's going to be a lot of young people making sure that we amplify those who are the most affected by the climate crisis right now. And COP needs to do much better next time to make sure that we actually have the communities most affected in these conversation rooms. And I think this goes for any conference and any place that world leaders are convening. We need those who are being affected by the climate crisis in those rooms so that we get the best solutions.
Justice, you know, there are people who are also more disproportionately affected by the crisis who should be present at those forums. And a colleague of ours actually always says, you know, young people are already seated less than other groups who are in positions of powers at the table. But if you only have young people from a specific group, then even programs such as youth delegates programs, which are established to create more equality, will unintentionally create new inequalities. And that's something that we should avoid. So thank you so much for sharing.
Only did the people accidentally leave
our online audience for Maurice, and the question says, how did the Dutch government initially reply to the generational tests?
Well, it came as a surprise to it that they actually quite immediately said, well, let's do it. The news article that I showed was, I believe, a week after the presentation of our advice. They said, well, that's a good idea, let's do that, which was quite a welcome surprise for us and a welcome change. Let's hope that with all the other advices that we are going to give them, they're going to implement them as quickly as they did with this one.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now I see that time flies when you're learning a lot of new things and having fun, of course, as well. But I would love to maybe squeeze in a question from our audience as well. Is there somebody in here that would like to pose another question that they want to share with us? I see one in the back. If you can say it, then we will repeat it for the people who are watching online. Yeah. So the question is, you know, young people are letting their voices be heard. They're speaking up about things, but the implementation is taking a little bit too long. So what can we do to speed up this process? Maybe Tijmen, I can start with you, being you know, also somebody from who can give us an you know, perspective from the government side. What do you think we can do to speed this lobby up?
Well, yes, being patient is not the right answer. So indeed, being persistent, actually trying to also think, so to say, think along, being pragmatic, so to say. On the one hand, trying to realize what was already mentioned, the whole logic, for example, of a government, or the logic of how international change happens. So on the one hand, be pragmatic, but don't become us. Like, keep your unique role and actually having that voice of young people being constantly really voicing their ideals and really saying what is on their heart is actually the most important thing. So I would say for these things to come together, find that perfect balance between, on the one hand, being pragmatic, but not losing your ideas and losing your enthusiasm and as a young person.
Thank you so much, Tijmen. So what we should prevent from happening is everyone turning into young diplomats. Yeah, please know is what Tijmen says. I think that's quite clear for a message. Now, I think it would be really nice still to get some final words from all our speakers. So to everyone, our online speakers, and also here in the room with us, if you could share with us in a couple of sentences what you think is the most important thing for people to know who are watching, who might be able to implement this or help spread the word further about the UN generational test. What do you think is important for them to keep in mind? And maybe I can do it the other way around. Maybe Christa, I can start with you if you want to go first for some couple of words for us.
And youth-led engagement, making sure that not only youth have a seat at the table, but are leading the discussions at the table and are empowered to do so. Make sure that we're emphasizing the importance of youth-led engagement through on-the-ground programs, whether that's clubs, educating peer-to-peer, educating not peer-to-peer, youth to adult, whatever way it is. again, bringing them to the table and empowering them to lead the discussions at the table and be partners in their own problem solving.
Super clear. Dan, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think Krista said some really meaningful things there that I think are really important. I'd like to say the really kind of shallow things, that there's something about this concept has a nice, simple, communicatable idea, this idea of a generational test. So getting 140, 150 countries to buy into that simple idea, even if they don't do it well, even if they do fairly bad quality participation, is quite a significant step. And that's one of the advantages of a well-packaged idea like this, is that it can spread and it has a lot of political opportunity that comes with it. And then you can establish that and work towards doing it well afterwards, I think, which may be a little controversial, but is perhaps an idea.
Yeah, but no, I get what you mean. And that's, I think, an interesting perspective to shed on this. Alexandria, would you like to also have some last remarks for us?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I love as well what Krista was saying about climate education and peer-to-peer especially. And so I second all of that. I also just want to say that I think that now is the time to be making your voice heard, and now is especially the time to be an activist. And so I think that we just have to continue in this fight and working together and raising awareness and educating each other. And then I know that we can get where we need to go if we do all that.
Yeah, that's, I think, a super beautiful, hopeful tone to end on. But going on to you, Tijmen, would you also like to share some of your final thoughts with us?
Of course, I think we should take from the discussion today as well, and from the UN, the idea of a UN generational test is to say how to go from ad hoc participation to really meaningful participation, and how to translate this at the UN level by connecting the dots, so to say. So that's what I take away from this.
Thank you so much, and passing it on right away to you, Maurice.
Thank you. I'll add to what Dan was saying, and Dan, I really don't think it's a controversial statement. I think it's the right statement to make. The same statement in the Netherlands, we said, we think it's going to work, so let's try it. I think the main thing with all those chances that we get as young people, when we find the right people in power that can make that change possible, that we create alliances and say, well, we haven't fully thought this out, but let's try it. And what's the worst that can happen? So I think that's my motto with many things in life, but especially when it comes to youth participation. Let's try. That's better than doing nothing.
I like that. That's an interesting one. Let's try. That's better than doing nothing. I'm going to remember it. Can we have one big round of applause for all the members of the panel for sharing their insights? Thank you so much to everyone, and we can clap. Applaud, I mean. Applaud.
There is one speaker who I mentioned at the beginning of this event, a very special speaker, because he wasn't here at the stage, but we will invite him to the stage because he played such a tremendous role in the whole setup of this side event and in the whole setup of the UN generational test. Welcome, Mert. And before we give Mert the full floor, I would like to add some nice words to it too, because Mert has been my colleague for the past year. He officially last Friday gave away the name of being a Dutch United Nations youth delegate, and he passed on the mic to a new one. But he spent the last 2 years of his life entirely spending time on evolving youth participation in the Netherlands. And I think that deserves more than just a round of applause.
I didn't intend to cry today. No, but thank you so much. And thank you all also being present, Krista, Dan, and Alexandria, because the entire idea of a generational test is not something that came out of nothing. This best practice was obviously created by the Dutch Socioeconomic Council, and the idea is to make sure that young people are being taken into account in the future as well, because what we see at the UN is that most of the times young people are only being used as a sort of a token for just popular Twitter stories and feeds, etc. And we believe that young people do have the capacity and also the knowledge to add and contribute to a lot of solutions right now. So when you look into, for example, the movements that we see at the COP right now, we see young people who are fighting for climate justice at the ICJ, World Youth for Climate Justice. That's an amazing initiative. You see young people trying to make sure that their voices are not just being heard on an occasional moment. No, they're actually trying to make sure that young people and the elderly are joining in on an intergenerational discussion. And that discussion is officially started, well, let's say last year at the presentation of the Hague Youth Manifesto. And today we're basically launching this campaign or this lobby strategy to make it known that this is actually something that multiple young people from multiple countries all around the globe want to achieve and want to pursue. So let this also be like a great message for our leaders who are currently in power, that the UN Generational Test is not something to exclude the elderly, so to say. It's just to make sure that young people are included and that we can have a diverse, inclusive, and intersectional, intergenerational dialogue. Thank you so much, and I'll just give the floor back to the moderators.
Thank you, Mert. Yeah, Mert, you definitely deserve those 3 rounds of applause. I mean, we sadly, very, very sadly, arrived at the end of our side event. But first of all, we would like to thank every speaker who was here today. It was an absolute honor to have all of you with us.
Yes, indeed, as Manuel said. And of course, an even bigger, or I should say equally as big, thank you to our audience for being here with us, asking all your sharp questions, sending in your comments, remarks. They were tremendously helpful to keeping this conversation flowing and engaging. Now, I can totally imagine that you're watching and you've heard all of this, all these insights, and you're saying, my hands are itching, I want to help, I want to contribute to this cause, what can I do? Well, you can do a lot. First off, you can start off by spreading the word about this generational test. If you're watching from another country, pick up contact with your National Youth Council. See with them how you can even spread the lobby further of getting a generational test and having your country support this initiative towards the United Nations. If you're one of the Dutch viewers that are watching, then please do get in contact with the youth delegates. You can reach them via Instagram at jongerenvertegenwoordigers. By the way, I'll drop Timon's Instagram as well. Then we can hold him accountable to do more on it. At Timon Rosenboom, please tell him to post a little more. But of course, please do get engaged with young people, with your local government, with your youth councils, NGOs, organizations. Let's all get together. Let's all connect the dots, work together so that we can push this forward. Now, if you also want to spread the message online, you can do so by using the hashtag #GenerationalTestUN, or you can use the hashtag JPM, Just Peace Month, because this event, of course, still perfectly fits into the light of that. And with that being said, I also want to thank our partners, the Dutch National Youth Delegates. We want to thank the Netherlands for co-sponsoring, all the amazing other youth representatives from other countries who are a part of this, the Hague Humanity Hub, of course, for letting us do this here present in their location. And of course, one last big thank you to the audience and our speakers. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope you learned a lot, and then we will see you at the next time.